Hello and welcome back to Between the Hashes, our weekly college football primer. Coming to you from Los Angeles, California, I'm your host, Matt Keim. And today, we're going to take a look at everything this college football season has in store for us, including maybe a few predictions. Now, today's headliner game is probably one of the more important games that's going to be played all year, which makes it extra cool that it's actually happening in week one. Outside of that, I don't think there's a lot of games that realistically should be seen as competitive. But that doesn't mean there aren't storylines that are not worth watching right out of the gate. So, for example, one of the big questions that's going to be pervading this entire year is, can Georgia do it again? By winning a title in each of the last 2 years, they have joined some very rare company and only a handful of teams that have gone back-to-back. But if you ask Georgia, they say they're not done. They want to go one more and three-peat. Something that has not been done since 1936. The opportunity to even try to three-peat is so rare that it's only happened 3 times since 1996 or the last 30 or so years. Of those 3 instances, 2 of those missed the national title game entirely. In the third, USC lost the game within the last minute in what many consider to be the greatest college football game ever played. Point being is that history is not on Georgia's side this year, and they do have some noise around new starter at quarterback Carson Beck as a very highly rated recruit, as a very athletic quarterback. The issue is he is replacing a ton of experience in Stetson Bennett, and while Bennett had his limitations, what he provided was stability and a lot of leadership and experience. And so those are some pretty big shoes to fill, no matter what your pedigree is. I know that Georgia's kind of at the point in their dynasty where they're not exactly rebuilding, but they're just kind of doing the Nick Saban style reload. They also lost half their team from last year, and many of the guys they lost last year were key players even in 2021. And so it's not that I don't think they can, because they have probably one of the easiest schedules in the country. So easy that honestly, by the time December hits, they may have only played 1 or 2 ranked teams, and their only real challenge might happen in December in Atlanta. And so they should be in a really good position to try it again. And regardless of all the lost experience and talent, there's plenty of other guys that step up. Plus, Brock Bowers, one of the best players in college, is still there. So, can they do it? Sure. But I personally don't think they will. If you're talking Georgia the field, I'm taking the field. I want to move on to a couple other team-specific storylines, both of which are reactions to what we have dubbed in recent years as Week 0. The first is Notre Dame, who crushed Navy in Sam Hartman's debut as the Irish quarterback. Now, this is significant for a couple of reasons, the first of which being is that almost by default, Sam Hartman might be the best quarterback that Notre Dame has had since Brady Quinn, and I really don't think that's an exaggeration. Sam Hartman was lighting it up at Wake Forest, and he's never been surrounded by this much talent. And if you look at Notre Dame's struggles last year, most of them came on the offensive side of the ball. A lot of injuries at the quarterback position, and they kind of developed their offensive identity as the season went on. But they should be a lot stronger on that side of the ball to start out the gate this year. We'll know a lot more about Notre Dame by mid-October, even, because they have to play both USC and Ohio State in the first half of the season. So we're going to know a lot about Notre Dame. But I like what I've seen from Sam Hartman. Admittedly, Navy's in a really bad position as a program right now, so I don't take too much from that game. But I do think the implication of them having a quarterback as talented as Hartman is something to watch out for as the season progresses. Now let's talk about their rival, USC. So I want to start with this. Caleb Williams is probably going to go first overall in the NFL draft. He'll probably go to New York as a Heisman finalist, or he should. Will he win? No, probably not, but he'll be in the conversation regardless. He looked every bit the part last Saturday against San Jose State. But it wasn't Caleb Williams that sank that team last year. The man played on one leg in that last game against Utah. You could tell the moment where he messed up his hamstring and then had to fight through it and almost brought them back in a game that they were thoroughly embarrassed by. They followed up that performance by getting lit up defensively by Tulane. And so this is my issue with USC. We're going to hear all the noise about their new freshman receiver who took a kickoff back and a very electric play, and then San Jose State stupidly punted to him like 4 plays later. The offensive side is not and never has been the issue with Lincoln Riley. But the fact that their offenses have to be so talented have always masked a lot of underlying issues with Lincoln Riley's teams. You can see this with Baker Mayfield's teams in Oklahoma, with Kyler Murray, with Jalen Hurts, and now with Caleb Williams at both Oklahoma and USC. The defense is always bad. They were horrible last year. They had huge problems tackling. They had huge problems covering. And they haven't really made any coaching changes. Lincoln Riley's had defensive coordinator Alex Grinch on staff dating back to his Oklahoma days, brought him over, and still retain him on staff going into this year. And here's what's going to happen. They are going to waste Caleb Williams' last year in college by doing this. You can make the argument that San Jose State's last touchdown in that game was a garbage time drive. Sure, but if you look at how those first 3 touchdowns happened, they happened when the game was still in doubt. I mean, converting a third and like 30 at one point, giving up a touchdown with 50 seconds left on the clock right after they took the lead. And some of it is just basic defensive lapses, basic things kept going wrong. And you can make the argument that USC has a whole bunch of new personnel. They did bring in a bunch of guys from the transfer, and to their credit, they do look better on the defensive line, but I'm just seeing a lot of the same stuff. And I know it might be a little too early to overreact to a week 1 game, but here's the problem. If their defense is giving up 400 yards of offense to San Jose State, they still have to play Washington. They still have to play Oregon. Bo Nix, Michael Penix, both of those guys are going to be in the Heisman conversation. They still have to play Notre Dame that now has a quarterback in Sam Hartman. What's going to happen when they meet those guys? And so until USC proves to me, and I think the onus is on them to prove that they have a defense, until that happens, I'm out on the Trojans. They might go to a nice bowl game, but they will not win the Pac-12, and they will not go to the playoffs. Now that my rants are out of the way, let's pick some games. Unlike last year, I'm actually going to start with the lightning round and then build up to the headliner game. So, lightning round. And quick caveat before I introduce this week's games, I don't necessarily think all of these are going to be competitive games. I do think they are worth paying attention to for one reason or another, and you're about to find out why. Number 1, Colorado visits TCU. Currently the line is TCU minus 20.5. The reason why I highlight this game is that both teams are going through some major rebuilds. In Colorado's case, they very famously or infamously hired Deion Sanders, and there are 70 new players on that team, most of whom were through the transfer portal, and a few of whom followed Sanders from Jackson State. Notably his own son at quarterback. And there's a lot of noise around the Buffaloes this year. They are coming off of a 1-win season and are doing an almost complete wholesale rebuild. On the other sideline, we have TCU fresh off of a national championship game experience, which left a lot to be desired. Most notably, almost every significant offensive player who got them to that game is now in the NFL. So Max Duggan's gone, Quentin Johnston's gone. Their offensive coordinator, Garrett Riley, he left to take the Clemson job. Replacing him is a controversial OC hire in Kendall Briles, and actually last year's starting quarterback in Chandler Morris. Will we finally see why Chandler Morris got the job over Max Duggan to begin with? We'll see. I think it's an interesting game just to see the trajectory of both teams, but I think TCU wins. I think they cover, and I think Colorado's in for a rough season. Number 2, Florida goes on the road to play Utah in one of their few out-of-conference games where Florida has actually left its own state. So good for them. What's not good for them is they're replacing a quarterback that went top 10 in the NFL draft, and this is off of a very, very rough year for the Gators in which they went 6-7, despite having that quarterback. They are playing against a Utah team on the road who is returning a ton of offensive production, especially on the offensive and defensive lines. Big red flag for Utah. Star quarterback Cam Rising tore his ACL in the Rose Bowl game, so it will have been about 9 months to the day since that injury. If Cam Rising's even half of what he is ordinarily capable of. I think Utah wins. I think Utah covers, and they avenge last year's upset loss. Number 3, the West Virginia Mountaineers go on the road to visit the Penn State Nittany Lions. While West Virginia is set to improve and they have a lot of offensive, especially offensive line experience coming back, I think they have something like 130 combined starts returning. They're not going to match up with Penn State. Penn State's going to win this. They're going to cover. But the reason to watch this game is that Penn State is trotting out a new quarterback for the first time in a few years by the name of Drew Aller. And he has a lot of hype around him. He was a very highly rated recruit, and Penn State fans have been waiting to see this guy. So I'm curious to see how he does in his first significant game act. Lightning round number 4. Probably the only other game that I expect to be super competitive this weekend. North Carolina visits its neighbor in South Carolina. The reason to watch this game is that North Carolina's quarterback, Drake May, is a very highly rated draft prospect, probably the second highest rated quarterback currently. And while South Carolina did end last year with some momentum, including 2 major end-of-season upsets, I think North Carolina starts the year with a win. And that brings us to our headliner game, the LSU Tigers versus the Florida State Seminoles. Okay, so this is going to be a rematch of one of the more entertaining games from last year. Florida State took a double-digit lead. LSU storms back and then loses by 1 because their game-tying PAT gets blocked. Can't get any closer than that. It's dead even. And one of the more exciting things about this is that both of these teams last year were in complete rebuild, and there was almost no noise surrounding them. This year, it's a different story. They're both top 10 teams. They're both expected to compete for the playoff, and whomever wins this game will have a major resume point because they both still have top 10 teams left on the schedule even after this game. So it will give the winner of this game some breathing room should they drop one down the road. Brian Kelly is in his second year at LSU. Former Arizona State quarterback Jaden Daniels is returning under center to an offense that averaged about 6 yards per play. So both of these teams were kind of rated right around the same place statistically. They were both roughly top 25 in offense and both roughly top 30-ish in defense, give or take 5 or 6 spots in each case. But they both return a ton of production. LSU returns a number of starters on offense, most notably Jaden Daniels, and in the second year, with another year of recruiting and transfers from Brian Kelly, they expect to just come flying out of the gate. Florida State might have the most returning offensive production out of anybody in the country. About 80% of their offensive production last year is back. And this is for an offense that, at the end of the season, averaged over 7 yards a play. They're led by Jordan Travis and have a very upperclassmen-heavy roster. They only lost a handful of guys to graduation or the NFL draft last year, and so this is very much a go year for them. While they're recruiting, especially since the later Jimbo Fisher era, their recruiting definitely dipped. They were 19th, 20th, and 23rd in the last 3 years. They seem to be picking up some momentum, and Mike Norvell does seem to have them going in the right direction. Are they ready to take that next step? We're going to find out this weekend. If I'm Florida State, one of the things that's most concerning is the blue chip ratio. And if you guys don't know what blue chip ratio is, it basically just means the percentage of your roster that is comprised of former 4 or 5-star recruits. This doesn't necessarily include transfers, especially because the transfer portal, being as prevalent as it is still a relatively new phenomenon, so there's just not as much data there yet. But the BCR hypothesis, I guess, describes how likely you are to win a national title based on how much of your roster is comprised of these former blue chip recruits. In LSU's case, they have a 71% BCR, and Florida State's not even at 50. So just to show you the recruiting imbalances between the two. But as I just illustrated, Florida State has so much returning experience that I don't think it's going to be that impactful on the field, but it might hurt them down the line this season. Another notable storyline for this game is that one of LSU's best defensive players and one of the SEC's best defensive players, defensive lineman Mason Smith, has been suspended for 1 game related to impermissible benefits. It relates back to him getting paid to sign autographs But the ridiculous thing is that it happened like just before NIL became legal. So look, I'm not going to do a huge long rant about this, but I will say that the NCAA can be as capricious as they are just totally arbitrary with this stuff. And this might not have been the hill that they should have picked to die on. Nevertheless, one of their best defensive players will not be on the field, which actually does kind of concern me because they're playing a very experienced offense. They gave up about 150 yards on the ground last year, which was like roughly middle of the pack. So losing pieces of your front seven is never going to help that situation. Now, granted, it's LSU. They have talent upon talent to stack in there. I do think week one is going to be a challenge for them. So the big matchup here for me is watching Jordan Travis versus that LSU defense and seeing just where their defense is. They only have 4 returning starters from last year, and one of them suspended. I gotta be honest, this is a super hard game to pick. The line's at 2.5 in favor of LSU. But I think this suspension just kind of swings it for me. I think Florida State takes the win. This is quite literally a coin flip game. I could very easily be wrong about this. What I do think is regardless of who wins or loses this game, both teams will still be viable contenders deep into the season, barring injuries or collapse. And so LSU's coming off of winning the SEC West and upsetting Alabama in a dramatic fashion. I actually think LSU probably should win the West again this year. And so you have an incredibly high-stakes game, but it's not a death sentence for the loser. I think both of these teams are on a great trajectory. I hate that I have to pick a game of this magnitude this early in the season because all I have to go on is data from last year, and it was a 1-point coin flip game. So maybe on that logic, I should pick LSU, but again, the relative inexperience on the defense scares me to the point where I kind of prefer Florida State to win in yet another close game. So, Florida State wins, and by winning, they cover. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. Do you agree with my picks? Do you not? Let me know in the comments. I want to know what other games you think are worth watching this weekend. It's one of our last weekends before the NFL comes back, and we have a cool opportunity to check out some of the next generation of that NFL right now. Give us a like, comment, subscribe. Check out Ampire Media, that's Ampire, where you can catch up on the John Keim Report for near daily updates on the Washington Commanders as they set to begin a new season with quarterback Sam Howell. Once again, I'm your host, Matt Keim, and welcome back to Between the Hashes.